If you're listening to this, chances are you're doing one of two things. You're either commuting or, let's be honest, you're avoiding something way more important that needs your full attention. That digital pull, that little flicker of FOMO, that urge to just see what's new on the screen that's literally right there, right next to your textbook or your work. It's kind of the defining struggle of the modern mind, isn't it?
It really is. And it's a universal challenge. It doesn't matter if you're a high-level executive trying to get through a quarterly report or, a high school student just trying to tackle organic chemistry.
Right.
So our mission today is to do a deep dive into the raw, observable data of our attention when we're faced with all this technology. We're trying to answer one core question. How long can any of us, and especially the generation that grew up with a phone in their hand, how long can we actually stay focused?
And for this deep dive, we've got a stack of sources, but we're centering in on this really influential observational study led by Larry Rosen and his colleagues back in 2013. And the thing is, this wasn't some sterile lab setup.
No, not at all.
They watched 263 students, from middle school all the way up through university, studying in their own homes, in their natural environments, for just 15 minutes.
And that methodology is so crucial here. This isn't survey data where people say what they think they do. This is behavioral observation. For 15 straight minutes, an observer tracked exactly when these students were on task, when they were off task, what tech was around them, and what specifically distracted them. It was all logged minute by minute.
And this is the core revelation we have to unpack today. It's the one thing that should probably change how you structure your entire workday. The data reveals the shocking, almost unbelievable truth about our attention. When these students were supposed to be focused, their average time on a single task before they just switched to something else, it was way shorter than anyone would guess. We're talking about what we're calling the 6-minute rule.
6 minutes. That's the figure we really have to grapple with. The average on-task run, as they called it, was 5.61 minutes. And remember, they knew they were being watched. Even then, they couldn't sustain a singular focus for a full 6 minutes. It's not just a lack of discipline. It might be something deeper, like a permanent neurological shift.
Less than 6 minutes. That feels both incredibly short and, if I'm being honest, terrifyingly accurate.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the environment that has, conditioned us for this kind of rapid-fire switching. We need to set the context for why this 6-minute monster even exists.
Right. So first, we have to acknowledge that for young people, especially college students, multitasking isn't just an option. The authors make it clear it's become the default way of operating. This behavior is so ingrained that other data confirm that a staggering 73% of college students said they literally couldn't study without some form of technology nearby. I have to stop you there. 73% can't study without it. That's not just using a tool. That's like saying you can't write without a specific pen. It's a complete dependency.
It is. It's become a necessary appendage, as you said, and it goes deeper. Within that same group, 38% said they couldn't go more than 10 minutes without checking a device. So that's a dependency that drives this constant internal switching. Whether or not a notification actually buzzes, it's the psychological urge that's in control.
Yeah, this sounds less like multitasking and more like, constant low-level vigilance. You're always on guard.
That's exactly the term for it. This is what the former Microsoft executive Linda Stone called continuous partial attention. It's that state of just being perpetually aware of everything happening in your digital periphery. You're constantly scanning for updates, for opportunities, for alerts.
And when you're constantly scanning the periphery, you can't do the deep work.
Precisely. Continuous partial attention, by its very definition, it prevents deep contemplation. It prevents sustained high-quality thought. If all your cognitive resources are tied up just monitoring all these different streams of information, you're stuck doing surface-level maintenance. You're shallowly processing 1,000 things instead of deeply mastering one.
And we've seen this pattern in other research, right, across different generations.
Oh, absolutely. One study tracked non-working time and found that young adults, we're talking people in their 20s, they task switched about 27 times an hour.
27 times. That's a switch almost every 2 minutes.
Every 2 minutes. Now, compare that to older adults who, adapted to tech later in life. They only switched about 17 times an hour. So while everyone's switching, this rapid-fire, high-frequency jumping is really, really heavily correlated with a life that's been immersed in technology from day one. It suggests the younger generation has developed a cognitive style that's just optimized for these rapid, shallow jumps.
Okay, so if the modern world has conditioned us to expect distraction, and the data says we switch every 2 minutes when we're just relaxing, Let's get back to the Rosen study. How did they actually quantify that fragile focus when students were supposed to be trying to study?
Okay, let's really dig into the methodology here because I want to paint a clear picture of what this actually looked like. This wasn't a clinic. This was observation in the wild.
It was. The participants were just told, study like you normally would. The observer, who was often a peer or a friend they'd trained to be unobtrusive, just sat nearby, maybe across the room, for exactly 15 minutes. And that observer had this detailed minute-by-minute checklist. It was essentially a spreadsheet tracking their every move.
So, minute one, are they reading a book? Yes or no? Are they on Facebook? Yes or no? Are they texting? Yes, no. Just ticking boxes. Exactly that. They were noting specific behaviors. So clearly on task meant things like reading a textbook, writing notes on paper, or using a website that was required for the class. Off task was, Facebook, instant messaging, watching TV, eating, stretching, or, and this is crucial, just switching computer windows. They also recorded every piece of tech that was in the room at the very start.
That detail is phenomenal, especially counting the windows. That's like a measure of their internal digital clutter. So after all that meticulous observation, what was the definitive finding? Did it confirm their hypothesis that sustained focus would be short-lived?
It was strongly confirmed, almost definitively. Now, participants were on task for a decent chunk of the time, about 65% of the total 15 minutes, so around 10 minutes overall. But the key metric, the one that tells the real story, was the average on-task run length.
Which means the amount of time they spend in uninterrupted, continuous focus.
Correct. And that average on-task run length was 5.61 minutes. That's our less than 6 minutes finding. It's so important to really absorb what that means. In an hour of studying, the average student is restarting their focus routine 10 different times.
I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. 5 minutes and 36 seconds just seems so incredibly short. But you said they knew they were being watched. Could this finding actually be inflated? Could the real number, when nobody's watching, be even shorter?
That is the exact question the authors themselves raised in their limitations. They acknowledged the risk of the observer effect, where people might try a little harder or be more focused just because they know they're being tracked. So if the observer's presence actually boosted their focus, then yes, the true unobserved attention span might dip well below 5 minutes. This 5.61-minute finding could be seen as the absolute best-case scenario for sustained attention in a tech-rich world.
Wow, if that's the best-case scenario. The implications for deep work are just staggering. So they're studying for 10 minutes out of 15, which sounds okay on the surface, but they're doing it in these tiny, fragmented bursts. They're paying the cognitive cost of switching over and over and over again.
And that cost is significant. As we mentioned, other research shows that time cost is immediate. When you're interrupted halfway through reading something, the task takes 21% longer to complete, even if your comprehension stays the same. You're paying the price in just sheer inefficiency and the cognitive effort it takes to constantly find your way back into the flow. It's like stopping your car every 6 minutes, turning off the engine, and then having to restart it and get back up to speed again.
Let's move beyond just the average and look at the dynamic quality of their focus. The study visualizes it so clearly. You called it a quartic trend, which sounds intimidatingly mathematical, but just tell us what that focus roller coaster looks like over the 15 minutes.
The term quartic just refers to the shape of the graph. It means it has multiple peaks and troughs. It's not a simple straight line. It's a volatility that perfectly captures that internal battle for attention. It looks like a heart rate monitor, just spikes and dips, a real roller coaster.
So where do the dips happen? Where does the mind give up most easily?
Well, the first big drop in the percentage of students on task happens really early, right around the 4 to 5 minute mark. And that dip aligns perfectly with that 5.61 minute average run length. It's a point where most students are hitting their cognitive wall and switching tasks for the very first time.
So the 6-minute rule is like a cliff, and the brain just takes a dive right off it.
It does. They might recover for a minute, but then focus drops again, even more dramatically. It hits a real low point between the 7-10 minute marks. That second dip is usually deeper and lasts longer than the first one. The 4-minute mark is the moment of temptation, and the 8-minute mark is the moment of surrender.
That's fascinating. 2 major focus failure points in just a quarter of an hour. They're struggling twice as hard as they are studying.
But then there's this interesting reversal. Focus tends to climb back up, and it peaks pretty strongly right around the 14-minute mark, just as the observation is about to end.
Okay, why do you think that happens? Is it just sheer willpower, or is it an artifact of the study design?
It's probably a bit of both. It could be the effort of just getting back on task after a serious distraction. But it's also highly likely that it's linked to the metacognitive realization that, hey, this thing is about to end. They know the 15-minute window is closing, and that provides this external deadline that forces them back on task, maybe to look good or just to feel like they finished strong.
So that late peak is more of an artificial external push than a genuine internal flow state. Okay,
Right.
now let's connect this focus roller coaster to the digital clutter, using that data on open computer windows.
Absolutely. Figure 2 in the study shows the average number of computer windows they had open, which is a great measure of cognitive load. And if you put the focus graph from Figure 1 next to the window count from Figure 2, you see this perfect self-sabotage loop.
And what does that loop look like?
Figure 2 shows that the number of open windows peaks between the 6 and 12-minute marks. Notice the timing. That spike in open windows happens precisely when the participants were least likely to be on task. It corresponds perfectly to that deep focus trough we saw between minutes 7 and 10.
So when their focus starts to fray around that 6-minute mark, their impulse isn't to simplify, to put the phone down or close the laptop. It's to open another tab, to seek more stimulation, which just makes it even harder to get back to the original task.
It's the digital equivalent of making a mess when you're stressed out. You're already struggling to focus on the one tab you need for studying, but instead of simplifying your environment, you open YouTube, or you check Wikipedia for something irrelevant, just desperately hoping that the next window will somehow provide the motivation you're missing.
And all that extra clutter means that when they try to get back to their history textbook at minute 10, now they have 3 or 4 other things running in the background, adding all this friction to their return to focus.
The internal cognitive load increases at the exact moment the student is struggling the most. It just drives them further off task, creating this deep trough of poor performance and digital chaos.
The natural assumption here is that this is a student problem. Maybe it just reflects bad academic habits. But the source material reminds us that this rapid switching is a human, modern, technological problem. It's not just about students.
That's so right. The source material draws these really strong comparisons. If you look at office workers, a huge study found they average just over 3 minutes on a task before switching. So students are, if anything, better at maintaining focus than the average worker in a tech-heavy office.
3 minutes for an office worker. That makes the students' 5.5 minutes look like a marathon.
And even in really high-stakes fields, the struggle is real. Medical students who were dealing with this dense, difficult, life-or-death material, they were found to switch tasks every 5 minutes.
So it suggests that no matter your age, your training, or how high the stakes are, the moment we introduce these ubiquitous digital tools, our sustained attention just defaults to this short, cyclical pattern.
Exactly. And let's just hammer home the consequence here. The cost of these interruptions isn't always performance. It's a 21% time cost that's the primary expense.
No.
And other research showed that interruptions often resulted in a resumption lag of more than 30 minutes when you're dealing with complex tasks. If you're switching tasks every 6 minutes, you're spending more time restarting your brain than you are actually doing the work.
So we know what the switch looks like. We've quantified it with the 6-minute rule. Now let's ask who is most susceptible to it and what are the actual drivers here. Let's look at the negative predictors of focus and then the protective elements.
Okay, so to figure out the drivers, the researchers looked at what variables significantly predicted reduced on-task behavior during that 15-minute window.
And what came in at number 1? What was the biggest red flag for distraction?
The absolute top negative predictor was simple. Just having distracting technology available at the start of studying. This is a critical finding because it means the mere presence of potential distractions in the room, whether or not you even use them, was detrimental to sustained focus.
So even if your phone is on silent and face down, if it's just sitting on your desk, your brain is devoting a little bit of its resources to just managing the possibility of that distraction. It's a decision you make before you even start, and it sets the stage for failure.
It is the environmental setup for failure. Second, high hours of daily texting was a significant negative predictor. And this wasn't just texting that happened during the 15 minutes. This was their generalized daily habit. The more they texted in their life overall, the more easily they were derailed during that study session.
That really speaks to the powerful pull of social connection being a driving personality trait, doesn't it? The habitual texters, the ones whose lives are built around that immediate social response, they're the most susceptible to the 6-minute switch.
Absolutely. Third, and this is maybe the most damning for the digital natives, Facebook use. Just accessing it at least once during that 15-minute observation was highly predictive of being off task.
Just one quick check of Facebook in 15 minutes was enough to significantly shatter your focus.
It shows that Facebook isn't just a time sink, it's a powerful disruptor. And that's likely because of the kind of emotional gratification it provides, which we can get into later. We also see physical switches here, which just underscore the general restlessness. Stretching or walking and watching TV also reduce the on-task percentage. These non-tech switches correlate with the tech-driven ones, and it just paints this picture of constant low-level restlessness and an inability to settle into deep work.
Okay, let's talk about what the students themselves said. When they were asked qualitatively why they switched tasks, what was their motivation, what were the top two reasons they gave?
The results are really straightforward and very telling. Number one was texting at 68%, and number two was boredom at 63%.
Wow, that combination is a perfect storm. Texting is the external social pull, the emotional gratification, that's the reward. And boredom is the internal psychological state that makes you vulnerable. It's the emptiness that the reward fills. So it's the moment the task gets hard or just a little bit dull that the brain defaults to the path of least resistance, and that path is social connection.
And that creates this powerful reinforcing mechanism. The text message acts as the escape hatch when the cognitive load of studying gets too high. We also see this reflected in personality too, specifically in what they call the task switching preference.
And how did that factor in?
Well, the participants who said they preferred to task switch, they generally had shorter on-task runs and were way more likely to be off-task overall. And what's more, you see that self-reinforcing cycle again. The people who preferred switching also tended to have more potentially distracting technologies available to them when they started studying.
So they're not only predisposed to switch, but they actively build an environment that encourages it. It sounds like they're setting themselves up for a battle they can't win.
Now, let's flip the lens and look at the protectors. What allowed students to break free from this 6-minute curse? What predicted staying on task?
I mean, we know the obvious answers, doing things that are studying.
Indeed. Things like reading a book, writing on paper, or visiting class-required websites. All of those predicted on-task behavior. But the really crucial behavioral component, the thing that distinguished the successful students, was the use of study strategies.
Tell us a bit more about what kind of strategies they were tracking.
These were metacognitive techniques. So things like actively making up questions while you're reading to keep yourself focused, or summarizing paragraphs in your own words, or mentally reviewing the material. The students who reported using these strategies were significantly more likely to stay on task for longer periods. It's the difference between passively staring at a page and actively engaging with the material.
It suggests that attention isn't just some fixed resource you have. It's a skill that you can manage and you can boost with intentional cognitive effort.
Precisely. If you go into a study session with a deliberate plan, a strategy, you create this internal structure that helps you resist the pull of all that external chaos.
Now, this research covered a huge age range. Middle schoolers, high schoolers, university students. Did the older, more mature students manage to escape the 6-minute rule?
Surprisingly, no. And that was the core technology paradox finding. Now, there were differences in how they distracted themselves. High school students spent more time chatting and texting. Middle school students played more video games. But despite those differences, the struggle was universal.
How universal are we talking?
All age groups had remarkably similar on-task percentages, very similar preferences for path switching, and they consumed similar total daily hours of media and technology. The average middle schooler, high schooler, and college student, they all fell victim to the 6-minute rule pretty much equally.
So the ability to focus is just compromised across the board, even if the flavor of distraction changes from Fortnite to Facebook. That's a pretty grim outlook for the future of deep learning.
It is. However, we have to note one positive difference from their data. The university students reported using significantly more study strategies than the middle schoolers. So while they are still getting distracted by that same 6-minute cycle, the older students have successfully adopted some metacognitive tools to kind of mitigate the damage and maintain their academic standing.
So the mechanism of distraction is universal. It's driven by the technology, but the management of that distraction improves a little bit with age and experience.
That's the takeaway. It means the fundamental cognitive mechanisms underlying task switching are being challenged by the media, no matter the learner's developmental stage.
To really understand why a 6-minute focus run is the new normal, we have to look past the distraction itself and get into the theoretical architecture of the mind. The researchers detailed this using some cognitive theories. Now, this section gets a little technical, but stick with us, because this model explains why the switching feels so painful and so inefficient.
We can simplify the architecture first. Just imagine your mind is a high-performance computer, a CPU with specialized programs and very limited working memory. The researchers frame all this using the unified theory of the multitasking continuum. This just explains the mechanics of switching, from doing things at the same time to doing them one after another.
Okay, let's start with the central processing unit of the mind, which is defined by the ACTR architecture.
Right, so the ACTR model suggests that our information processing is handled by these relatively independent modules. Think of these modules as specialized workers in your cognitive factory. Each worker handles a different kind of resource.
Can we walk through who those workers are?
Absolutely. First, you have the declarative memory module. This is your vast library of facts, knowledge, and stored instructions. This worker's job is to retrieve information you already know. Second is the goal module. This one is critical. This worker tracks the progress of your current task like complete Chapter 5 summary. It keeps your objective alive. Third is the problem representation module. This is your temporary workspace, your scratch pad. This worker holds new information you need right now, like the complex numbers you just calculated. And finally, you have the procedural module. This is the foreman. This worker connects and monitors the flow of information between all the other specialized workers.
Okay, and the critical rule that governs this whole factory is key. All four workers can operate separately, but each individual module can only work on a single task at a time.
That constraint is the source of all our multitasking pain. When you try to simultaneously read a dense textbook and respond to a complex email, you might be asking two different tasks to use the same specialized worker at the exact same moment. And this leads us directly to threaded cognition theory.
And threaded cognition explains the traffic jam, right?
It explains the interference, the bottleneck. If two tasks are similar, or if they require complex mental work, they're very likely to need the same module at the same time. For example, reading a textbook requires the problem representation module to hold new facts. If you switch over to Twitter to read a political thread, that thread also requires the problem representation module to parse and store new information.
So instead of doing both at once, you get a traffic jam, and one task just has to wait.
Exactly. When the text thread demands the same cognitive resource as the study task, the studying thread is temporarily paused. So the cost isn't just the time you spent reading the tweet. The cost is the delay and the increased time it's going to take to complete the original study task. You've created a bottleneck.
And that delay and frustration, that leads directly to the third theoretical component, which is memory for goal theory. This explains that agonizing feeling when you try to get back on track.
Yes, the resumption lag. So when you consciously switch to the interrupting task, let's say you watch a YouTube video, the goal module, which was holding the objective study history, is told to drop that goal and activate the new one, watch video. The original study goal immediately begins to lose activation. It just starts to fade away.
And this is why we stare blankly at the page when we try to come back to it.
Correct. When you finish the video and you look back at your history book, you don't just pick up where you left off. You have to spend precious cognitive resources just reactivating the original goal. Where was I? What was I doing? What did I just learn? This is the core reason for that 30-minute resumption lag they found in complex tasks. Your specialized workers have to spend time searching for and reloading the blueprint.
It really sounds like task switching isn't just inefficient. It's a profound violation of how our cognitive architecture is designed to handle deep work.
It's a very high-cost violation. Now, these theories explain how the mind struggles, but they still don't fully explain the irresistible emotional urge to switch every 6 minutes. For that, we have to turn to motivational theories.
Right. We've established that boredom is a key driver. What theories explain why that digital escape hatch is so much more appealing than the difficulty of studying?
So we look first at uses and gratifications theory. This basically proposes that we are very active media consumers, and we're driven to use media to satisfy these deep-seated needs, cognitive, social, emotional, or just habitual needs.
And when students are multitasking while they're studying, they're not really looking for knowledge, are they?
No. According to the research, when students multitask in this study context, they are not satisfying cognitive needs. Instead, it's the emotional gratifications that step to the forefront. They're using their devices to satisfy the need for social connection, or validation, or excitement, or just to reduce anxiety.
And that's a perfect explanation for why those high daily texters were the most easily pulled off task. The text provides this powerful emotional hit that the textbook simply cannot compete with. It's an immediate reward system.
It's a very powerful self-reinforcing mechanism. The study also links this behavior to flow theory. Now, we usually associate flow with the state of complete absorption in a challenging but enjoyable task like playing an instrument or writing. It's characterized by these high positive feelings and high arousal.
So how does social media hijack flow theory to make us ditch our work?
Well, research indicates that using social networking, specifically Facebook, is associated with achieving a core flow state. It's characterized by that same high positive feeling and high arousal. Facebook is just designed to provide immediate feedback and novel stimulation. It often balances the challenge, scrolling through tons of content, with the skill-rapid information consumption in a way that makes it really addictive.
And the result is that flow state it compels our attention. The emotional reward is so immediate and high arousal that the primary activity, like studying, just becomes dull by comparison. So the student is constantly seeking the easy high of that digital flow, and that's what triggers the 6-minute switch.
It's a transition driven entirely by this search for immediate emotional reward, not by logical necessity. The brain just learns that to feel good and energized, it has to switch.
So this whole system, this bottlenecked brain, the 6-minute focus run, and this drive for emotional gratification, it has a real-world cost. Let's look at the hypothesis connecting these digital habits directly to academic performance using GPA.
The findings here are some of the most critical for any learner. The hypothesis was confirmed, at least partially. Students who accessed Facebook at least once during that short 15-minute study period had significantly lower grade point averages.
So we have a statistical link. A single quick switch to Facebook is tied to lower overall academic performance. That's a pretty strong warning sign.
It is. And this isn't an isolated finding. It corroborates earlier, larger-scale research showing that students who spent more time using things like Facebook and texting while doing schoolwork had lower college GPAs. One study found that, on average, GPA dropped by 0.12 points for every 93 minutes spent on Facebook, above the daily average. That might sound small, but over a semester, that can easily be the difference between a B and a C average.
What's fascinating to me is that the researchers went beyond just the tech factors and looked at the psychological attitudes that predicted high academic success.
Yes. Beyond the distraction variables, 2 attitudinal scales were highly predictive of GPA. Using studying strategies predicted a higher GPA, and the scale measuring confusion while studying predicted a lower GPA.
Which emphasizes again that high achievement isn't just about being smart or avoiding your phone. It's about metacognitive skill. The students who plan their study time and actively engage with the material suffer less confusion, and that leads to better grades.
It's the intentional planning that acts as a cognitive shield. Now, let's go back to that personality factor, the task-switching preference. While the overall preference wasn't a direct predictor for everyone, when the researchers compared the highest GPA group, the 3.51, and up to all the others, the top achievers showed a significantly stronger preference for unitasking.
So the top students, the ones consistently getting the A's, they've already figured out that the 6-minute rule is a trap. Their natural preference, or maybe their learned behavior, is to finish one thing before they start the next.
They're the minority who are resisting the emotional pull of continuous partial attention. The data suggests that high academic performance strongly correlates with the ability to maintain a singular focus and resist that need for constant instant gratification.
And this task-switching behavior doesn't just affect GPA over the long term, it hits your learning retention immediately, right? And we know this from a controlled experiment.
Yes, that controlled study was a masterpiece in understanding real-time interruption. They had students watch a 30-minute lecture, and they randomly assigned them to different groups. One group got 0 texts, another got 4, and the last group got 8 text messages. And critically, these texts were timed to interrupt the exact moment the to-be-tested information was being displayed.
And what was the immediate outcome on the retention test they gave them afterward?
Students who were exposed to 8 text messages during those 30 minutes performed significantly worse on the retention test than the students who got 0 texts. They just failed to encode the information that was being presented during the interruption.
So there's a physical limit to how many interruptions our memory process can handle before it completely fails.
There is. But what's interesting is that the 4-text group did not perform significantly worse than the 0-text group, which suggests there's maybe a low-level threshold of distraction that the brain can sometimes absorb and recover from without significant damage, maybe through that rapid internal switching we're not even conscious of.
But the real lesson here, and I think the most encouraging finding, is about the importance of self-control and metacognition in managing these interruptions.
Absolutely. Within that same study, they found that students who chose to wait up to 5 minutes before reading or responding to a text performed significantly better on the retention test than those who replied immediately.
Wait, so if they got a text but they made themselves wait 5 minutes to respond, they did better on the test than the students who answered right away.
Precisely. This suggests that the mere act of delaying the gratification of replying allowed their mind to finish processing the lecture material and stabilize that cognitive thread before they engaged with a secondary task.
Yeah.
It just demonstrates the power of conscious choice and metacognitive control over that impulse to switch.
It's the difference between being a slave to the notification and being the master of your own 6-minute attention cycle. That's a powerful skill. Okay, so we've established the problem. The 6-minute cycle is driven by cognitive constraints, emotional cravings, and it correlates directly with lower achievement and poorer retention. The central question now is, what do we do? How do we manage this environment effectively?
The first temptation for parents and educators is just to ban the phone. But as we've discussed, the researchers caution that this approach is often fruitless. It can even be counterproductive.
Right, because if you ban the device, the distraction doesn't just disappear, it shifts. The source highlights that removing the phone just shifts the distraction from an external alert, a buzz or a light, to an internal, anxiety-laden need to check in. The phrase out of sight is definitely not out of mind for this generation.
And this isn't just a theory. The anxiety is measurable. Other research show that 41% of college students felt moderately to highly anxious if they couldn't check their text messages. That's nearly half the students. And when you force a learner into that high anxiety state, you're creating a really suboptimal learning environment.
And that anxiety actually drives a measurable neurological shift that impairs deep learning. This is where it gets really interesting.
It does. When you engage in constant task switching, whether it's driven by external alerts or that internal anxiety, it causes this profound shift in your neural activity. Your brain activity actually moves away from the hippocampus and toward the striatum.
Okay, let's simplify those two regions. What is the hippocampus responsible for?
The hippocampus is the region that's responsible for purposeful thought, for context, for deep memory encoding and comprehension. It's the type of learning you need for a history exam where you have to synthesize complex ideas.
And the striatum.
The striatum is associated with rote or habitual learning muscle memory, automatic tasks, procedural skills. Think of learning how to drive a stick shift or memorizing a phone number just through endless repetition.
So when a student is switching every 6 minutes to check Facebook, their brain is physically diverting resources away from the area they need for complex synthesis, the hippocampus, and shunting them toward the area that handles repetition and habit, the striatum.
It's a literal neurological cost. Distraction doesn't just slow you down, it fundamentally alters how you encode information. It favors superficial habit over deep conceptual understanding. If you study history while texting, you might memorize a few names. That's the striatum. But you will fail to grasp the deeper context and implications. That's the hippocampus. We need strategies that manage this internal conflict.
So since just banning the phone causes anxiety and messes with your brain activity, the first proposed solution is management, the technology break.
Yes, this strategy acknowledges the reality of that emotional pull. It acts kind of like a sanctioned coffee break. It provides these periodic, planned opportunities to check in and just quell that internal social network anxiety without disrupting the middle of a complex thought.
And how do you implement this in a structured way that actually works?
The key is synchronization and managing expectations. So, students are allowed to begin their study period by briefly checking their devices. Just get that initial hit of gratification out of the way. Then they silence the devices and place them face down. And they know, critically, that they will be able to check in at the next scheduled technology break.
This manages the anxiety because the check-in is just delayed, not denied.
Right.
It leverages that finding that students who delayed their text response performed better.
And trials of this system proved to be really effective. Researchers reported that using an alternating sequence of a 1-minute technology break, followed by a 15-minute lesson or study period, successfully boosted attention, improved focus, and enhanced learning outcomes. The 15-minute block respects the 6-minute attention span, but it pushes the learner to attempt a longer, more structured focus run, all while knowing that a reward is coming shortly.
It's structured, compassionate focus management. I like that.
The second strategy involves acknowledging that not all distractions are created equal. The observational study found that listening to music while studying did not predict off-task behavior or lower grades. This suggests that some forms of low-demand multitasking are benign, or maybe even helpful for some people.
So why is music different from social media in terms of cognitive impact? The unified theory of multitasking should explain this, right?
It does. According to the theory, music, especially very familiar, instrumental music, should have a pretty negligible impact on task switching. That's because its task demands are very low. If you're listening to something you know well, your brain doesn't have to devote significant resources to the declarative memory module or the problem representation module.
And it's using different sensory pathways.
Exactly. Crucially, music uses the auditory modality, while the primary study task is usually visual or cognitive, like reading. Because the specialized workers required for listening to music are different from the workers required for reading a textbook, the interference is minimized.
So low-demand, non-visual tasks that use different cognitive modules can be okay, maybe even protective by blocking out other more damaging environmental noise.
The final, and I would argue most essential, strategy revolves around training the student, not just managing the device. This is the whole concept of metacognitive skills.
We've touched on this a few times, the ability to plan your study and actively engage with it.
Yes. Metacognition is just knowledge of your own cognitive abilities. It's knowing when and how to interrupt your own focus. The ultimate goal isn't controlling the technology. It's teaching the internal mechanism of self-regulation and delayed gratification.
What does superior metacognitive skill look like in the context of digital interruption?
The source cites a study where students were working on programming exercises and they were allowed to use instant messaging. The students who were assessed as having more metacognitive skills, they chose to turn off the sounds on their instant messenger. They only responded to messages when they were given a break or when they reached a natural breakpoint in their work, like finishing a line of code.
They chose to wait until the task reached a natural breakpoint. That shows superior self-management. They were the masters of their own interruptions.
Exactly. Conversely, the students with lower metacognitive abilities, they just let themselves be interrupted whenever a message appeared, regardless of what they're doing. So the educational goal has to be to teach that high-achieving behavior, training focus, attention, delayed gratification, and that critical skill of identifying when multitasking will actively interfere with deep learning versus when it's appropriate.
Yeah, the bottom line, as the authors put it, is that students want to task switch, and technology encourages it. We can't just stop them without putting them in a really unmotivating environment. The trick is developing models that allow for appropriate and structured multitasking that respects the emotional need to connect without sacrificing the cognitive depth required for real learning. This deep dive into the science of digital distraction has been illuminating, and frankly, a little anxiety-inducing for those of us who struggle to get past that 6-minute mark. Let's quickly recap the essential takeaways.
First, the 6-minute rule is real. It's confirmed through real-world observation. On average, students can maintain sustained focus for less than 6 minutes before they switch tasks. And the cost of those frequent switches is profound inefficiency, huge time loss, and that dangerous neurological shift away from the hippocampus toward the striatum, favoring rote memory over purposeful learning.
Second, the link between Facebook use during study time and lower GPAs is powerful, and it's confirmed. This is about more than just time wasted. It's about succumbing to that emotional gratification and the high arousal flow state that social media creates, and it pulls essential cognitive resources away from academic work.
And third, effective strategies require management, not prohibition. We have to address the internal anxiety caused by that persistent need to check in. Strategies like the 1-minute, 15-minute technology break, and most importantly, teaching metacognitive skills. They offer practical pathways to restore focus and teach that necessary skill of delayed gratification.
Now, a quick note on the study's limitations, which the authors themselves acknowledged. We mentioned the observer effect. The students might have been more focused because they were being watched, which could actually inflate that 6-minute runtime. If that's true, the true attention span might be even shorter. Also remember, the link between Facebook and low grades is correlational, not strictly causal, though the association is incredibly strong.
But even with those necessary caveats, the findings paint this clear picture of an ingrained behavior pattern. And this leads us to our final provocative thought, one that really challenges the future of education and work itself. The study asked participants to imagine the ultimate high-stakes focus scenario, studying for an absolutely essential final exam, a class they had to pass to graduate.
The class they absolutely cannot fail, the moment where focus should be absolute.
Even in that high-stakes scenario, 40% of the participants still intended to include texting, listening to music, and accessing Facebook in their study regimen. 40%.
If the intent to swish and the environmental setup for distraction is that deeply rooted, if it overrides even essential academic survival, what does this tell us about the future of designing learning environments?
It raises the question of whether we, as a society, have to abandon the old industrial era expectation of the uninterrupted 90-minute focus session. If the 6-minute attention span is here to stay, does that mean that deep, sustained, unitasking work is obsolete for the next generation?
Or do we have to instead structure how we deliver knowledge and how we structure professional tasks to maximize retention within those tiny cyclical focus windows? Maybe the future isn't about fighting the attention switch, but rather designing systems that anticipate it and just ensure those 6 minutes are as intensely productive as possible.
If the battle against technology is being fought and lost by 40% of students who are facing existential failure, then we have to change the battlefield. How do we create content and structured deadlines that acknowledge the cognitive reality of the 6-minute focus cycle? That's the challenge for all of us.
Food for thought indeed. Thank you for guiding us through this essential deep dive.